before I get back into Another Kingdom, I just want to make a recommendation for a documentary which you can find on Netflix, probably other places too. It's called Minimalism, a documentary about the important things. I'm not a minimalist per se, got too much junk for that, but the idea appeals to me, and of late I've decided to basically not try not to buy anything unless I absolutely have to. The minimalists are a couple of guys who have sort of shorn themselves of a whole lot of material possessions, and this documentary comes at the same issue that Brueggemann and all are talking about in Another Kingdom from a secular perspective, just from the perspective of what actually gives people the most peace, joy, and happiness. So anyway, if you watch it, it would be a nice supplement, I guess, to what we're discussing here in Brueggemann and all's book. I say and all instead of et al because I'm not fancy. So Brueggemann and all talk about neighborly beliefs. Remember, they made a distinction between the contract mentality and the covenant mentality. The contract mentality is about self-interest and it's sort of finite. The covenant mentality is about more or less duty, a sense of responsibility, and it's built on trust. So next they want to go back into the covenant mentality and focus in on neighborliness. What does it mean to have a neighborly covenant? They say that it rests on beliefs in abundance, mystery, fallibility, and the common good. And it places faith in our communal capacity versus our consumer capacity. I like the fact that they say it places faith in, because coming at this from the theological perspective, they really are making the argument that we as human beings always have a faith, and the question is where we're going to place that faith. Is it going to be in ourselves, in other words, to form a true community because we are more than material beings, or do we place faith in ourselves as consumers, in which case we're placing faith in the economy, in technology, in those kinds of things that are worldly. Both are a type of faith in people, but in the first instance, the faith is in a people that thinks beyond narrow self-interest and that obtains happiness from each other. The other faith is a faith in people as materialistic consumers to be able to work to grow and grow in order to achieve some material ideal. And by the way, this is a big part of the minimalist message, which really resonates with me, which is the more you want, the more you have to work. And then life becomes for work rather than work for life. This is the curse of debt, that both parties in a marriage, for instance, have to work so long and so hard that they often don't have a real satisfying family life. What do they mean by abundance? They say to believe in abundance is to believe that we have enough, even in the wilderness of an uncertain future. A manna-based culture calls for an end to the belief that a community or institution or even business has to grow or die. In any case, the future is uncertain. It's just that in the contract way of thinking, you think that the future can be certain, whereas once you let go of that, I suppose, you know that the future is uncertain and that you basically have to, roll the dice and put your faith in whatever, in this case in other people. They call it a manna-based culture because they're harking back to the story of the people of Israel wandering in the desert, and at one point they are starving, and God does a miracle and places this food, this whatever this is, this manna, bread-like substance, all over the ground like dew in the morning. But it's an allusion to the idea of placing trust in their case in God, also placing trust in the world as it is created to provide. Probably most importantly, placing trust in other people, that they will not abandon you, which is always a risk, and especially now because we're so used to abandonment. And they're saying that a mentality of abundance there's no longer this grow or die mentality, but rather a maintenance and enriching way of thinking. What do they mean by mystery? They say mystery is an opening to the unknown. And they argue that if we accept mystery, we can appreciate the non-productive activities. I'm using that term, they don't use that term, but non-productive in the classic capitalist sense, activities such as spending time, food, appreciating food, silence, reperformance, which means ritual. These very human activities don't really have a direct material payoff, and yet they are hugely psychologically fulfilling and spiritually fulfilling. So what's the connection with mystery? Well, I think what they're saying is that these non-productive activities, while very human, are ones, again, where the outcome is uncertain, where, as a matter of fact, you're more on an adventure than you are on a certain trip to a certain destination. And so they argue that it's these kinds of things that open up people's minds and imaginations. Then they argue, quote, mystery also has a relationship to justice. Justice begins with a vow. The vow enables the emergence of justice. They talk a little bit about the marriage vow there. Again, this harks back to the original distinction between contract and covenant. The contract gives you the illusion of certainty, in this case the marriage contract. Once made, it is an agreement between two rational subjects to spend the rest of their lives together come hell or high water. There's an expectation, often broken, that both parties are going to perform that contract. But a vow is something more. A vow, I guess, is like a promise. It's a sort of solemn and sacred promise in which there is no absolute certainty, no sort of illusion or dream that the arrangement is about individual self-interest. So what's that got to do with justice? Well, I gather what they're saying. Sometimes their writing is almost a little bit too minimal to be able to fully draw out with certainty exactly what they're trying to get at. But here, I believe they're saying that human beings are more, we are not just the rational, self-interested, materialistic self-maximizers that the market mentality would have us. But because we are bigger than that and we have more capacity than that, we can be greater than that. That is why the pure contract doesn't do a person justice, especially in a situation like a marriage, but in many other relationships as well. Relationships of care, and in this chapter, relationships of neighborliness. They say a vow requires mystery to be valid because if there is no sense of mystery, I don't think the parties involved really understand what they're getting into. They are more or less living an illusion of certainty. They have a little section called A Place for God. They say, the claim of God stands as a limit against the reduction of reality to a commodity. That's the barrier, and that's the usefulness of God. That might be a little bit of an unfortunate turn of phrase, the usefulness of God. But knowing Brueggemann, he's not saying that we boil God down to something that's useful for our psychological state or our social order. There's a lot about God, in his view, that is not particularly useful to people because for him, God is beyond that or bigger than that as well. But if we were to look at the usefulness of God, it would be, at least in this context, that the very existence of a God creates a sort of barrier, as they say, against the reduction of reality to a commodity, because God is the affirmation of a spiritual life, of another aspect of life. They then go into a little bit of a criticism of the contemporary stance of many people to be spiritual but not religious. They say that that is too individualistic, that it kind of represents our tendency to turn inward and again just feel like we can rely upon ourselves and not really connect with other people. So that's the problem with that. Well, then they deal with holiness as a concept. They say every neighbor is somehow a carrier or a reflector of holiness, and therefore must be honored in some way and not just utilized. This is a very old idea that is very biblically based. Jesus says, if you do this to the least of these, you do it also to me. This is the idea that God is in every person, and therefore when you meet your neighbor, you should automatically give them hospitality and honor because of who they really are on the inside. You can see how thinking this way would forestall the idea of looking at people in utilitarian terms, which, is almost inevitable, and I'm sure it's not totally a modern phenomenon either. No, it's not, right? To look at people as though they're instrumental, right? But we're talking about the ideal, about where they would like people to head in their way of thinking about each other. They turn to the concept of wilderness. They say, the wilderness is the Old Testament metaphor for a covenantal social order. Well, that struck me as odd at first because, of course, a covenantal social order is exactly what they want, and you would think of that, I guess automatically I would think of that kind of as their promised land rather than the wilderness. But what they're saying is that at this point in time, the covenantal social order, the true community, is like a wilderness to the modern mind. It's frightening, it's the unknown. They say neighborliness is the unexplored modern wilderness. It's not viable from the point of view of the market. The market can't really do much with neighborliness. Neighborliness, to the extent that people do for each other and share with each other, gets in the way of the market maximizing. And then they remind the reader that in the desert, the Israelites received the manna, also water from a rock, and quail for meat. And they say it turned out that the wilderness was presided over by the gift and life-giving God. So I spent pretty much this entire time on one chapter because what they do is they just condense an awful lot of really neat ideas to contemplate into very short chapters and paragraphs. It really is a kind of contemplative book. I drew one thing out that I thought kind of summed up their point, that they see the contract way of thinking as the mentality of limitless growth. But this is, in their view, trying to be like God. In other words, they evoke the themes in the Bible having to do with, sort of like, in Greek mythology, Icarus, who wants to fly, he flies too close to the sun and his wings fall off, right? In the Bible, the people build this huge tower, and it reaches too high, and God has to knock it down. Or even, the flood, the original flood, has the same feeling. And there are other stories in the Bible that have to do with human beings' hubris. So, they argue that the covenant way of thinking recognizes limits and is more realistic and doesn't put people up as though they were God. This quote is interesting. They say, the 10th commandment is to not covet. So they link the sin of coveting to this desire for limitless growth. So there you go for this week. There's your radical Christian ideas.